Kim, and thank you, Long Now Boston. I'm delighted to be collaborating with all of you again this year on an event that is co-hosted by Emerson Contemporary and Long Now Boston, and is held in conjunction with an exhibition that we have up in one of our spaces. So I'm delighted personally to welcome Kerry Tribe and also Dr. Cohen to Long Now Boston for an inspiring and expanding conversation on our most human of capacities, cognition. In preparing for tonight's event, Kerry and I discussed who might be a good fit for this conversation, and she quickly suggested Mark Cohen. They have met once before in the artist studio and felt there was much left to say. Both are interested in each other's disciplines and eager to ask questions, find places of connection, and perhaps even identify some intriguing gaps or differences. In terms of our format this evening, each speaker will introduce their research-based practice by way of a short individual introduction, and then we'll transition into an interview-style conversation where they will be asking each other questions. Then we will open it up to you, our audience, at the end. But before beginning our conversation, we're going to take a look at the exhibition that provides the occasion for this event this evening. Onomatopoeia will be on view at Emerson Contemporary until March 26th. Created between 2010 and 2021, the works included in this exhibition reflect the artist's longstanding interest in consciousness, memory, and the limits of linguistic communication. We prepared a short video walkthrough of the exhibition to set the stage for tonight's conversation. Please join me in watching and taking a look at this wonderful and thoughtful exhibition featuring Kerry Tribe's work that is on view in Boston as we speak.
Donald's diario en un barrio llamado Los Gris. Me dijo, todos nuestros maestros son hablantes nativos. Se ajustarán a mi nivel y intereses.
Brain molecules, billions, billions, atoms, spilling, speaking, and thinking, and
People started to say that we couldn't get him down, that the broadcasts were fake and Sergei was dead. Of course, the satellite footage was so bad, it would have been easy to fake.
Мы все видели две версии ретушированной фотографии группы космонавтов, ту, с которой удалили Нелюбова.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So that last piece, the last Soviet, I believe Kerry will tell us a little bit more about that, but that piece is of particular significance and relevancy, again, with our current situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the gallery, I wanted to just say that the gallery will be open Wednesdays through Sundays, 12 to 7. One of the beautiful things that happened in making this exhibition is that when all these works came together, and this is the first time that these works are actually together in the same space at once, there was a number of new connections and new meanings that revealed themselves, that as Kerry and I were sitting amongst the works as they were around us, not even on the wall yet, but just sitting in the space with them and just talking about them, there was quite a few exciting new connections that we could make and new meanings that emerged as these works were in conversation with one another. So I highly encourage you to go visit the exhibit if you can. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce Kerry Tribe. I'm going to keep it short because it's just a personal preference. I don't like listening to long bios in a talk. That information is on the website and on Kerry's site, but Kerry Tribe is a visual artist, an experimental documentary filmmaker. She was born in Boston and is now based in Los Angeles. Rigorous and thoughtful, Tribe's practice synthesizes cinematic, journalistic, and conceptual approaches in probing and effective works of art that privilege the viewer's embodied experience in the gallery. And, coming and to the exhibition and spending quite a bit of time with that, I now very much feel that the work is about the embodied experience in the gallery, which is something that continues to be special, especially in the world of virtual events. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kerry Tribe.
Hi, it's so nice to be here. And I'm just going to take a second to sort out my technical things and make sure I share the right screen. I think if I hit that, it will be correct. And here we go. And I think I want to make sure I get to the beginning of my slideshow, which I will do. And you have to just like pretend you're not seeing any of this. Close your eyes until I say go. Everybody close your eyes. This is how I roll, by the way. I work in highly technical media, and I never, ever fail to have technical difficulties, preferably at the very last possible second. That's my kind of my MO. So if anyone shares that experience, you're not alone. And I'm going to get my view arranged. Okay. So it is really fantastic to be here. I'm so grateful for this invitation. I'm grateful that so many people have showed up. I hear we kind of sold out before we unsold out and opened up some more seats. I want to really thank my hosts at Long Now Boston for thinking to bring me and my the wonderful curator of this exhibition, Dr. Leonie Bradbury, who was a real joy to work with, and Mark Cohen, who I've had a couple of conversations with, and we never seem to have enough time. I'm sure we won't have enough time today to get to the bottom of things we're interested in, but I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak with him. And I just want to give a little plug also to Jim Manning, who put together that little video. He really put together the show and was responsible for much of the technical behind the scenes work that made the exhibition possible, and put together that little video that captures the experience, I think, of being in the show quite nicely. So yes, so I'll begin. This is just a little slide of a work that I made many years ago, one of my first public works in Los Angeles, and I thought it was an appropriate place to start for a conversation about the now, the future, and the mind. And now this is going to play because I know how to make this play. And you're going to help me make this play, Anna, because you know how to do that. How do I?
Are you ready to the next slide?
Yeah, great. Okay. I'm going to hide myself there. So I trust somebody will pipe up if you have a hard time seeing this. So if you'd like to make an artist nervous, you should ask them to succinctly tell you about their work, or to tell you what their work is about succinctly, which is what I will endeavor to do now in the next 9.5 minutes that have been allotted to this process. So I like to think and feel and want to communicate that my work might best be described as having to do with thinking and feeling and wanting to communicate. A little background in terms of medium. I make movies sometimes in a kind of traditional movie making way. Here I am sort of serving as director, and experimental films, often with complicated looping machines. I make videos and have done a number of public projects. I make photographs and drawings. I've made a number of sound installations, some of which also involve complicated looping mechanisms, and live performances, occasionally sculptures. Basically, the work takes whatever form seems most suitable to the ideas that I'm interested in. And in that regard, I think I have a sort of dual, I've inherited a dual legacy of experimental film and conceptual art. Onomatopoeia, the exhibition that's up at Emerson, includes some new work along with projects from the last 10 years or so that all really could be said to have to do with how we make sense of experience and the world around us, particularly through the cognitive processes of memory and linguistic communication. In general, I want my work to produce for the viewer something of what it feels like to be the subject of the work, the way an onomatopoeia performs the thing that it describes, like woof. So performativity in the linguistic sense is important to me, enacting rather than just describing experience. And I'll talk about a few ways in which this plays out in my projects that are on view right now. So for example, in the way that I edited The Last Soviet, whose narrative revolves around the last cosmonaut to ever serve in the Soviet space program. He was stranded on a space station in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed beneath him. People on the ground, suspicious of Soviet disinformation, didn't know what to think of his failure to return to Earth after 311 days in space. He did eventually return to Earth, but he was only supposed to be up there for a couple of weeks. And the piece is edited so that the voiceover comes before the image that the voiceover appears to describe, producing a sense of the instability of official narratives where meaning orbits its target without ever squarely landing. In another video that you saw a clip of, Aphasia, the story of photographer Christopher Riley, who has struggled with language ever since a series of left hemisphere strokes left him aphasic, is intercut with my own story of struggling to feel at home making work for an audience in a foreign country and a foreign language. And I'm going to show a brief excerpt of this work now.
Brain molecules, billion
Kerry, because you muted yourself, we don't hear the audio from the video.
Codo.
That's tragic. Good thing you heard some of it during Jim's nice
Nariz.
video from the beginning.
Dedos de los pies. Piel. Oreja. Pies. Otros pies. Zapatillas. Zapatillas. Más zapatillas. Zapatillitas. ¿Cómo se puede ser conocido por otro?
In Forest for the Trees, a monitor nestled among potted tropical plants mutely announces a kind of fragmented string of metaphors that suggest an individual who can't seem to connect with its natural environment. You have to settle into the work's rhythms before what it's saying starts to make sense. Play a really short clip of this. This is viewed from outside on the street, where I think the installation is particularly inviting. It was like 16 degrees that day. A lot of my work uses cognitive dissonance strategically. These are some silkscreen posters that reference a test designed to assess one's ability to name the color that one sees rather than the word that one reads, or maybe it's vice versa. I don't actually remember. So you can imagine that while my work isn't about the cutting edge or distant future of neuroscience, I am really interested in some of the paradoxes that cognitive science speaks to as we try to understand ourselves in the present and our future selves. I'm especially interested in the so-called hard problem of consciousness. That is, how is it that physical phenomena, brain processes, give rise to conscious experience? And how can a body, which is just a bunch of physical matter, generate all on its own a sense of self at the center of everything? How and why must it be like anything to be me, or to be you, or to be one of my pet chickens? This is Panzu featured here. This sense of self is clearly bound up in, but not coterminous with, our bodies. In fact, we tend to feel as though we have bodies rather than the other way around. And the lie that we are stable and fixed selves becomes clear as our bodies age and our relationships with those nearest and dearest to us evolve. How then does our sense of self too evolve? The newest work in the exhibition, seen in the upper right corner of this image, is called Corner Piece. Those of you familiar with art history will recognize the title from lots of works made by lots of men over the years. This is a video that crawls up the corner of the room and comes and goes throughout the day. It's based on a series of real text exchanges that I've had in the recent months with my growing children here on the left and my aging mother here on the right. I'm always in blue, and I ping from side to side across the corner, across this kind of generational divide, depending on who I'm texting with. So here you see my son texting me on his way home from school on the left. Where are you, kiddo? I stopped to film a spider. What? It's a brown widow and it's eating a gecko. Oh my God, you have to see this, etc. And in this image, you see my mother's effort to get Siri to call me here on the right. The video, because it's projected in broad daylight and it's kind of up and out of the way above the desk, can be easy to miss until it pings with every new message alert, interrupting any concentrated effort to focus on the more centralized work of the exhibition, which is really what it's like to be me these days, trying to stay focused on the more centralized work of being me, which is to say, being Kerry Tribe, the artist, and not just Kerry Tribe, the mother and the daughter and the caregiver. So the self that is me in this work is endlessly shifting back and forth in my role as caregiver to my children on the one hand and my mother on the other. And I'll just finish this brief presentation with one little last minute clip from this piece. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Kerry. I love those last two clips in the expanded form. Those conversations are so touching and vulnerable. And your work makes me think that we were all always in a state of becoming. So thank you for that. So now we're going to switch to Dr. Mark Cohen. He is a neuroscientist and professor in residence at UCLA, where he leads the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, where through the development of modern methods of neuroimaging, he explores the relationships between structure and function in the human brain, particularly as related to higher level cognition, such as mental imagery. This is one area in particular that I'm interested in the imaging of the brain and brain imaging and how that relates to the art type of imaging and the imaging that artists bring to us. But I don't know if we'll get there tonight, but please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Mark Cohen.
Well, thank you so much for letting me participate in this. It's really just a complete thrill to do this. And I'm trying to work out my screen sharing here. I'll be showing slides. I assume that shortly you're able to see my slides. Does that work? I think
We see your whole,
whole
screen right now.
Okay, hold on. Let's try one more time. How about that? Just have the slides?
Yes.
Yep, that looks
fantastic. Okay, great. So I'm a neuroscientist and professor at UCLA. My passion is to try to understand the physical nature of human consciousness, how it is that evolution shaped us to have a particular sort of consciousness that allows us to gather weak and incredibly unreliable information from our senses to develop a set of perceptions about the external world that make it appear complete, ordered, and meaningful, which is kind of a neat trick given that none of these things are apparently true about the world around us. Through most of my career, I've worked to develop instruments and methods to allow us to probe the function of living, mostly human brains. Among these is the technology known as functional MRI or fMRI, which I'll introduce briefly. Many of you might have experienced MRI as a particularly slow way of taking medical pictures, but it needn't always be so. About 35 years ago, my colleagues and I developed a practical way to collect these images at video rates up to about 30 frames a second. While it might not seem intuitive that a movie of a stationary organ like the brain would be of much interest, these images proved to be pretty revealing. Here's an MRI picture taken in 1991 when I was working at Boston at Harvard. It's a slice through my own brain, roughly in the location shown here in blue. And if you look closely, you might see that the bottom part of the images, let's see if it's working now, is flickering slightly. It was really kind of the back part of my head. Well, it turns out that while this movie was taking, we were flashing lights on and off in front of my eyes. And the signal in that part of my brain changes when the lights are on or off. We can do a very simple bit of signal processing here by simply removing the average signal from each location. And you can very clearly see, I hope, parts of the brain getting bright and dark And these regions turn out to be functionally part of our visual system, actually my visual system. It's now conventional to summarize these fMRI movies by coloring the brain images that change most reliably when the subject performs particular behavior. And you end up with pictures like this. We interpret the colors as the likelihood that any given brain location is involved in whatever task the subject is doing. fMRI, performed this way, is uniquely powerful as a way of harmlessly identifying and locating brain regions that we use when performing mental and cognitive operations. The regions used in various mental tasks differ, but each time we perform a particular task, we generally use the same areas of the brain. And significantly, these functional locations are very similar from person to person. A garden variety neuroscientist looking at these pictures would quickly identify the colored areas as belonging to the motor movement system or to the areas responsible for language. These days, it's become simple to teach a computer to recognize brain patterns that are considerably more subtle than these. One trainee of mine, Don Vaughn, who happens to be on the call, was able to identify the religion of his volunteers simply by watching how their brains respond to pictures of the hands of people whom they had been told were of different religions. Two other trainees, Sam Harris and Pab Douglas, showed that fMRI could be used to tell whether or not a person believed in statements such as Nevada borders California or that Jesus was born to a virgin mother. Other scientists have pushed even deeper. For example, Yukiyasu Kamatani and his colleagues in Kyoto used fMRI to scan the brains of people as they slept. From this, amazingly, they were able to at least partially peer into the contents of these people's dreams. All of this seems pretty wonderful. With these tools, we're getting incredible knowledge about the mechanisms of the human mind. But consider this. I have the result of your brain scan. We found all of your computer passwords, evidence that you cheat on your taxes, and the secret place where you hide candy from your wife and kids. In point of fact, these days, fMRI challenges the idea of mental privacy, something predicted 100 years ago by the great legal scholar Louis Brandeis, who wrote in some of his work on the right to privacy, advances in the psychic and related sciences may bring means of exploring unexpressed beliefs, thoughts, and emotions. That places the liberty of every man in the hands of every petty officer, was said by James Otis of much lesser intrusions than these. It was a thought that horrified him. Should we be frightened as well? Well, I am. You might discount this worry, saying that MRI machines are huge and stupidly expensive and therefore pose no practical worry. But we all know that with motivation, technology consistently has allowed us to build things that are smaller, cheaper, and more efficient. Besides, MRI is just a tool de jour for localizing and observing brain function. New methods are always under development, and we can be certain that what we have today will be eclipsed in our lifetimes. One of Kerry's themes is our fallibility in understanding the thoughts and the feelings of others. She has an acute sense of the difference between our behavior, what we say, and how we feel, experience, or think. The Last Soviet, one of the pieces that I've just gotten exposed to in the Onomatopoeia show, is just one example. In the not distant future, because of technologies such as fMRI, those boundaries that separate our thoughts and actions might become murky. As I've learned more about brains, I've become increasingly interested in what I'll call the generative nature of perception. And this is not a new idea. It's arguably just a 21st century rewrite of the concept laid out by Anaxagoras 2,500 years ago, when he formulated the philosophical theory of idealism that holds that we can't know things as they actually are, but only as we perceive them to be. Few biologists would argue that our senses are accurate, but what's particularly striking to me is how unaware and undisturbed we are, but we're unable by what we are unable to feel, hear, see, smell, or taste. To begin with, we sense very little of the energy around us. For example, while we're bombarded constantly by electromagnetic energy, we detect only a tiny fraction of it as light. Presumably, this is because our survival as a species doesn't depend on seeing infrared or ultraviolet. But until very recently in human history, we had no awareness of the existence of the other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. Our senses always are incomplete, yet making accurate guesses about the missing information can easily become a matter of survival and reproduction. Where we don't have data, we fill it in. We do this at all levels in our nervous system. But my work has led me to the conclusion the so-called cortical columns of the mammalian brains are directly responsible for these filling in operations. We have perhaps 20,000 such columns distributed more or less uniformly across the surface of our brain. They're remarkably similar across all locations, and it's as though evolution found such columns as a solution for the general problem of predicting from limited information. As our brains became larger and larger, evolution just provided us with more and more cortical columns. But that's part of the standard evolutionary playbook. If something works, just make more copies. We know also that different parts of our brain perform quite different functions, that we use similar mechanisms to fill in gaps in our visual field, to fill in gaps in time, or missing information about social interactions seems to me to be profound. But we can show that interpolation and extrapolation across many of our behaviors share many of the same features and properties, probably because they share the same machinery. Recent advances in mathematics, particularly in compressive sensing, provide some insight into how this filling in might work. To help you understand this, consider the problem of image compression. The files for digital photos are commonly compressed using JPEG, which is similar to MPEG for movies or MP3 for sounds. These algorithms often allow us to reduce the file sizes by well over 90%, even though the compressed images are perceptually indistinguishable from their original uncompressed versions. In effect, this means that our brains are making use of perhaps 10% of the visible light information that falls on our eyes. These compression methods work because our brains fill in the missing data with plausible guesses. Artists know all about this. I like to ask 4 questions when I show this slide. What is this a picture of? What is she doing? How does she feel? And how did Picasso feel about her? Essentially, everyone comes up with the same answers. By the way, he loved her. But this picture has another remarkable feature, not including the signature. It contains just 29 lines. For all intents and purposes, there are an infinite number of ways by which an image might effectively represent a sleeping woman. Yet we are very much predisposed to draw certain teleological conclusions. Had Picasso called this piece "Still Life with Fish," we would have been mystified. The more technical word for this sort of perceptual predisposition is bias, and bias is a necessary ability for us to navigate our worlds. Some of these biases, such as those exploited in JPEG and the like, operate at a very low level. For example, we assume that lines of similar size and orientation are connected, even if our view is partially obscured. These biases operate in the very first parts of our visual system, literally embedded within the retinas of our eyes. Other biases are no doubt burned in by evolution. We have brain regions that are highly specialized to detect and understand faces, for example, and evolution would long ago have built in the capacity to avoid large animals with sharp teeth. Further biases or predispositions clearly are learned, such as understanding various languages or figuring out that a fork is something to eat with. The flip side of this is also very strong. We're extremely adept at not seeing what we don't expect and at not seeing the elephant in the room, excuse me. Are the reconstructions made by compressive sensing algorithms or by our brains accurate depictions of the world? To me, and I'll just skip that slide. To me, it's incalculably unlikely that the answer is that the world outside of us is in fact sparse. Instead, I come up with a very different conclusion, and that is that what we see is what we know. And I think you'll also find that the work that Kerry has placed in the Emerson Gallery and elsewhere in this world speaks to many of these same questions, making it just all the more exciting that I'm getting this opportunity to chat with Kerry. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I see lots of people clapping.
That's very gratifying.
Wow, it's hard with the Zoom, but wow. All right, so that's already so much to think about. I'm still thinking about your garden variety neuroscientist comment. I'm like, what kind of neuroscientist is that?
Well, I would say that a neuroscientist who took Psych 101 would probably get that far. These are kinds of things we know about the brain these days.
Yeah. So I think, the point really is for Kerry and Mark to be on the floor here. So if we could spotlight Kerry, please.
And Mark and I talked, Mark had this idea that it would be, that makes sense. And I think the organizers of this event thought it would make sense because I have this exhibition up, and Leonie, you invited me, for me to be primarily the interview subject. But I feel it is such a great opportunity for me to have Mark present, that maybe what we'll do, if it works for you all, is maybe Mark will ask me a question, and then I'll ask him a question, and we'll sort of go back and forth, and things will just get looser as we go. And somebody will give us fair warning when we're starting to run out of time. Does that sound good?
Or to get boring. That could happen too.
Ever.
Yeah.
I think that sounds great. I think I would love to be that fly on the wall of your conversation. So go for it. I don't know who's going first, but maybe Mark, you can
I'll
go
start.
first and ask, and Kerry, and then
I'll start. So I came across Kerry's work first through a piece that she did called The Standardized Patient, and it appeared at SF MoMA. And she didn't talk about it this time. I urge you to, in the audience, to research this. But the standardized patient is a way of teaching medical students to do their diagnoses efficiently and accurately. And they have an actor come in, pretend to be a patient, and the doctor, who is a medical student, I guess, pretends to be a doctor. And Kerry's piece does this wonderful thing of looking both inside and outside of the environment. You get to see maybe what's inside the medical student's head and what the fake patient is doing. It's a wonderful thing. But it made me hyper aware that Kerry is very, very sophisticated about her science, about her biological science, and about her medical science. And often the pieces that we see here, aphasia, the Stroop colored word test, these are kind of tools from the neuroscience literature. And I guess I'd start off with, Kerry, do you see yourself as teaching when you do this work, or are you just trying to evoke the sort of sensations and feelings of your audience?
Maybe I'll just really briefly share. There's one image in my, while I talk, because I'm more comfortable if people look at other things. Are you seeing the picture now from Standardized Patients? This is, I shared it
yes,
before.
I am.
Yeah, so
we see it.
this is me on set working with Standardized Patients, an actor who some of you may recognize from such television hit series as Mad Men on the right, and a number of actors who are trained to professionally perform for medical students. And yeah, so I think your question was, how do I know about this stuff, or how did I, right? Wasn't that your question? I was so busy trying to find my image.
No, really, both how you got there, but also with your pieces. I see them as education.
Okay, yeah. So, well, to be frank, I think that I see them as I see myself actually as learning through the pieces more than teaching. So I feel like it's a tremendous privilege to be a visual artist. I think it's one of the few fields in which we define our own parameters, unlike the commercial arts, unlike forms of meaning making that have predetermined standards. I get to walk into a space and say, this will be architected in the way that makes the most sense for my work. The medium will take the form it needs to. And in that regard, when I find things that really interest me in the world, I'm a little bit like a journalist. I am tasked, my work tasks me, my profession tasks me with learning more about it. And then, yes, figuring out how to sort of synthesize that learning for a broader or a different audience. So I often find myself fortunately working with people that know a great deal about their area of expertise, which is usually something that going into it seems interesting to me, but I know nothing about. And then the project inevitably evolves. And what I find happens is that I'll typically go in, for example, a project I made about aphasia, people with aphasia. I thought it was to be a project about aphasia. And you said something in your introduction about how, we all have the same hardware. And while that's true, what often sort of moves a project through its evolution is the relationships that I develop with individuals who are either experiencing unusual neurological conditions or know a great deal about them. And in that way, coming to sort of see the world from their eyes, I start to think, how can I make sense of, synthesize, and sort of turn this around in a way that does justice to the science or the history, so that people who are experts in their field and know more about this stuff than I do will buy into the work and believe in it and have something to say about it. But I also think about audiences like my parents and my children and my students and people on the street. It's really, to me, a great kind of standard, or a really valuable standard, to think, how can we make texts, which I believe works of art are, that speak to this kind of range of audience and that can be entered at different levels. So my first task is really to learn myself. And I think my second task is to find a way to make what I've come to understand accessible to other people.
So then it really is an educational process. That's
It is,
all
yeah.
a teacher could ever hope to do, is to learn something and pass it on
That's right.
to your audience as students. That's very fun. You spoke just now to the importance to you of really understanding these subjects. I know for a fact that your husband is an artist. Who are your informants who get you all of this incredibly sophisticated knowledge about neurology?
Right. Well, there's one person I met a couple of years ago named Mark Cohen. He's been very helpful. He recently shared a few documents with me that I found totally enlightening.
Yeah, but that was last week. That was last week.
No, I know. And I was already like, oh my God, I have to change my whole presentation because all of these ideas are like blowing my mind. No, I to be totally honest, I usually are not actually motivated to make anything until I've gotten other people involved who I care about. So, and this is something I'd love to get into with you maybe in my next question for you, which has to do with empathy, that I often feel when I've built a relationship with someone, if I can convince someone who knows a lot about something to work with me, or that the project that I have in mind is worth them paying attention to, this kind of new thing emerges that's more than the sum of its parts. So when I made a work about patient HM, I took about 6 months to read whatever I could in the literature about patient HM, the famous amnesiac, before reaching out to Suzanne Corkin at MIT and saying, I'm just an artist, I never studied neuroscience, but it would mean a great deal to me if you would let me in on some of what you know. And I often joke that my mutant superpower is convincing people that it's worth thinking about artwork, and that there is meaning to be gained from encountering sophisticated discourses in this sort of other kind of, in a different way, in a way that has, as I was saying before, sort of less stringent parameters and can kind of be invented. So I've worked with journalists and newscasters, children, doctors, fighter pilots, experts about the LA River. And it's that kind of collaborative nature and I think empathic sort of relationship that's built along the way that makes these projects possible. So
you have it's everybody. It's everybody's your informants, of course, but yeah.
Yeah, they're all my informants. But like with standardized patient, I spent a lot of time behind the scenes monitoring all of these encounters many of the encounters between medical students and the actors they're working with are filmed with closed circuit television. So I spent about 8 weeks, almost full time, behind the scenes in a basement at USC, watching encounter after encounter after encounter unfold in real time, and then speaking to the medical students and the standardized patients afterwards and finding what that meant for each of them. And the resulting project kind of performatively took two different sides. You walk into the exhibition and you see one projection from one person's point of view or another from someone else's point of view. And that kind of privileged position in which you can, decide sort of whose side you're going to identify with is something that felt like a kind of a new way to get into this subject matter. But can I ask you about empathy?
Of course.
So empathy has come up a lot in my work in recent years, both in terms of, I think, as a motivating factor for how I work with people, but also as a kind of goal in much of my work. And this is sort of a personal question. I have dealt my whole life. It's a question about empaths. The short question, which I'll lead with, is, are empaths real? Do empaths exist? The slightly longer question is, what can we see from brain imaging about empathy or empathic responses? And then the third question, the third part of the question, the most personal part, is when we find sort of non-neurotypical individuals who have sort of highly unusual and excited responses to certain stimuli, Do, you know, and this is a more philosophical question, but I'd like to hear your take on it. You know, what do we do with that? Because I often feel that there's something wrong with me, that I can't turn the empathy off, that I can't, you know, watching the news has been devastating the last couple of days and weeks. But maybe it's actually a problem of categorization. The problem may actually not be with the empaths of the world, if there is such a thing, but with the world that doesn't really lend itself towards people that are highly sensitive in different kinds of ways. And this was my experience working with people with aphasia. While they struggle to talk about things in traditional linguistic terms, their ability to communicate, at least the individuals I met, was really extraordinary. And I felt a kind of, it's going to sound very woo-woo and non-scientific, but almost a kind of shared nonverbal mind reading happening between us, where we were really on the same page in a way that is not afforded by the sort of normative modes of back and forth discourse linguistically. So I'll let you pick whatever part of that you want to run with.
Wow, big important questions. Let's start off with, I forgot, was she Commander Troy, the empath on Star Trek? I've forgotten what her rank was, but do empaths exist? I think that the psychiatric literature might tell us that there's normal people and there are sociopaths who lack a certain kind of empathy. There are people with spectrum disorder who often lack a certain kind of empathy, but the normal mode is empathic. I think everybody's empathic. It's a survival and it's critical. There is actually a great deal that modern neuroscience has to say about some of the physiology with this. People have gotten very interested in a phenomenon they call mirror neurons. And the idea here is that you would put electrode into somebody's brains, which amazingly enough people do, and you would be able to detect that parts of their brain would respond to things that they see as though those people were doing it themselves. So I would watch your hands and sort of the hand motor control part of my brain would respond. And that mirror neuron phenomenon is pretty well established, and people did it in monkeys, and people have started to use my kind of brain imaging for that sort of work. So we do see the signs of it. I did mention the work by my student, Don Vaughn, about reading religion. And Don is here to correct me, but he's on mute, so he doesn't get a chance. But the general idea here was that we found that those portions of the brain, which are signatures for empathy, responded differently when you were looking at somebody who you felt was part of your tribe, your religion. In fact, he went so far as to be able to let people identify to something trivial, the color of a wristband that they were wearing, and they had a larger empathic response to people wearing the same color wristbands. So I'll start off with, there's nothing abnormal about you being empathic. It's probably a really good thing. But
it complicates life, right? Just as being on the autism spectrum complicates life. So I don't know. It's very exciting to discover, and for me to learn about the way that we can classify and categorize human experiences. And then there's also a part of me, particularly in my life as a teacher, that finds, I was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD, and suddenly I can say, oh, well, I'm going to blame that on my ADHD. The reason I got these slides together so last minute, everybody, is because, well, I have ADHD. So, I don't know, maybe that's a larger philosophical question, but.
Well, ADD is preserved in our population from the evolutionary point of view. If it was something so awful that it kept you from reproducing, we would have gotten rid of it. But instead, it actually offers some advantage for survival. So, you can wear your ADHD flag with pride.
Okay.
One thing you said challenged me in an interesting way when you were talking about that you felt that people who had language difficulties somehow were exhibiting a different kind of and perhaps more empathy. And it does make an argument that perhaps the artifice of language is actually sort of a boundary, a barrier, because language can only convey certain things. Body language can convey a million other things, and we tend to discount those until we can't talk.
Right. Well, that might bring us to another question about art and affect and its relationship to cognition and understanding. And, you know, I'm an artist and I understand you're a musician, and I know that art and music are very important to your life. And so we might change the conversation a little bit to think about what it is, you know, well, I'd be curious to know what role art and music in particular has played in your life, and if that has had a direct influence on your research and thinking.
Am I able to share my screen? I hope. Let's give
You
that a
should
try.
be able to. Yep.
Do people see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do art and music, how do music and the rest of my life fit together? This is the famous Hillbilly Ranch in Park Square in Boston, which while I was studying at MIT was kind of a distraction because I was performing at the Hillbilly Ranch a bunch of nights a week. And in fact, I found this picture in the file. I'm in 3 of the bands there. So it's a very funny thing. So how does art and how did music and the science go together? Well, you know, I've tried for a long time to find common ground there. And the best I can really say for myself about it is that doing science is fundamentally, if it's done well, it's a creative form. It's something where you really have to go out and formulate new ideas and express the new ideas, and certainly those two are bound together. I have tried and failed to do what I think are the kinds of experiments that might inform me about, you know, what music is or what visual art is, except maybe those little things I told you about the sparsity of images. I'm not sure I've got the satisfying answers to that question, Kerry. I wish I did.
Well, I mean, for me, I would just say that I'm often struck at the power that the sonic, and this is something you probably know a lot about. You know, it seems to be through the soundtrack, at least in my experience as an artist working in time-based forms, that feeling is delivered. You know, you change the soundtrack to the same set of images and you can radically change how someone feels about them, which is interesting to me because images, you know, are worth 1,000 words, but maybe the soundtrack is worth 1,000 more. I don't know, do we find this in brain imaging, that the parts of the brain that light up emotionally, you know, when, I don't know, does the amygdala get particularly triggered by moving music?
Well, absolutely. People have gone ahead and studied this and seen that, in fact, you do get those kinds of emotional responses to music. Absolutely. Whether that tells me something deep or not, I don't know yet. I can tell you that some of the most interesting work that I look at in the literature has to do with what we call sensory integration and multimodal sensory integration. So your visual system is quite slow. Our screens are updating maybe 20 frames a second right now, but our visual systems are too slow to see this as a bunch of separate frames. However, if I add sound, which you can measure to tens of milliseconds easily in your head, you can actually alter people's time perception for whether a visual thing occurred when it appeared on the screen or when they heard it. And generally, the auditory system has primacy for timing, which is kind of a fun thing. Mm-hmm. And there's an artificiality to actually making a distinction between sound and vision and touch and taste and smell, in the sense that we have organs for these things. We have eyes, you know, we have ears, but by the time they reach our brains, they're just little ones and zeros coming down the neurons. And if you connect your ears to the back part of your head, you see sounds. I guess there's this other question then about, you know, what's the emotional interface for language and music? And I certainly feel like it's bound up in prosody of our voices, in how we articulate things, and that's kind of echoed by emotional music.
Thank you. Your turn.
So, yeah, okay. So one of the things you've touched on is memory. And your pieces explore memory in a lot of interesting ways. I've had the privilege, and unfortunately not the rest of the audience has, of seeing some of Kerry's work, for example, the looping work, in which we get to see a series of images sort of wrapping around onto themselves, and the question of antecedent and precedent in those pieces becomes confused. You don't know where cause lies anymore in a piece like this. And I think that this is addressing really, really deep questions about memory, because you're questioning, as you do this, I think, the veracity of memory. You're questioning, can we really trust what we heard as being in the past? The Last Soviet clearly does something like that. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your history with this. You know, HM is a whole different thing, but you're in the memory business.
Yeah. Well, so my history with it begins when I first started making videos. The very first video I ever made and exhibited was a kind of experimental documentary about my senile grandfather. It was made 25 years ago, and I see Corner Piece as a kind of bookend to that project. Now I'm in the position that my mother was in, having taken a lot of care of her aging father. And what's become clear, I mean, my answer, so I find it really fascinating that what these aspects of our personalities and our personas that we feel are so fundamental to our existence, like the memories that we have, like the stories we tell about ourselves, can actually be wiped away with damage to regions of the brain, like the hippocampus, where episodic memory is encoded. And it seems, my understanding of patient HM, who I did a lot of research on, by and large I would say he was very much still himself, even without any episodic memory. So there is that kind of, there are questions around the cortical substrate of memory and episodic and semantic memory, and those are super interesting to me. And then there's the question of kind of the function that memory serves in our lives, and what is the structure of memory in that sense. And there, I think I take a more kind of psychoanalytic approach. I really believe that we create and recall our pasts in ways that are critical to our present moment, and that the thin slice of the present is always on this sort of precipice of projections about the future and recollections about the past that allow us to form a conveniently coherent sense of self. And I think it's fascinating and ironic that the more we recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but events from the past, the more we overwrite the original recollections that we have. In other words, the neural networks that were laid down as experiences were being experienced. When those experiences are being remembered, there are new neural connections being made. So it's sort of never the same thing twice. And Freud wrote very interestingly about the role of the screen memory, which I love because it invokes cinema and that kind of screen also, which is to say that the past, as in dreams, is sort of relived and re-experienced in order to meet the needs of the present. That's my sense of things. And it strikes me that no matter how much we come to understand about how memory works neuroscientifically, the way that memory works experientially will continue to be sort of endlessly interesting and productive.
Yeah, memory, in my opinion, and time itself are tied up. Our evidence that time exists is solely memory, and the fact that that there's something beautiful about our memories in the past, and somehow the further away from us, the less confident we are of what the real past is. I mean, it's just endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that makes me think also about, I'm a little self-conscious about the context of this conversation being for Long Now Boston and what we have to say about the future. And I'd be curious to hear what you think about, so this will be I'm just gonna sort of blather my question and let you take of it what you want. but I'm thinking both about the future, about the limits and future of what can be known about the minds of others through brain imaging and technology. And I'm also thinking about the way in which, how to say it exactly. Well, as someone who's interested in meditation, the subjective witnessing and experience of the present moment unfolding in meditation, in a practice that's quite different from reading other people's minds through brain imaging, seems to me, and it may also speak to this question of sort of sparsity of information, it seems that the less distraction one intentionally engages with, the richer and closer one can get to what it really feels like to be alive, awake, conscious. And you alluded to fMRI machines and sort of wearable technologies, and I've got my Fitbit, and some people may be wearing their Aura sleep rings. And meditation is also a kind of feedback process, as I believe looking at great works of art is. We understand ourselves and what it feels like to be present, awake, alive, and aware in the kind of complicated and largely unstructured encounters we have with difficult works of art. We feel ourselves feeling and thinking. So is there, I mean, I guess I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts about the future of wearable technologies, biofeedback, and you spoke about evolution. And while, of course, we are primed to see and experience what we already know, we also develop through a lifetime of exposure over the course of our lives a set of biases and references that enable us to see some things and not others. And this may get to why people believe disinformation campaigns and fake news's popularity. So I guess my question has something, like if you want to, take any inroad into it, has to do with what it is, how is it, are there, I guess, what are you excited about or not excited about in technological developments in the future that might allow us, now that we know that we see what we have seen before, what we're trained to see, is that a kind of, does that offer a possibility of us really changing how we are in the world? I mean, could we decide as a culture that we all want to be more empathic, more sensitive to others, and as a result, train ourselves through biofeedback devices, perhaps, to attune to what it really is like when we're in that state of, activating the mirror neurons or something like that? Did that make sense?
Yeah, it made sense in 20 different levels. There's 20 different really interesting things from that.
All right.
These kinds of tools, the imaging tools, they're a wildly double-edged sword. The fact that I can look at my thoughts is a problem, because so can you look at my thoughts ultimately. And,
Right.
Your wearables, I mean, I was going to joke that, yeah, I can see your heart rate through here, which I probably could with just a small amount of work. So I do worry a lot about that. And when you discuss the idea of training empathy, right, which is a good idea. I like the idea. At the same time, we also learning a lot about training to be effective with disinformation. And, the technology of advertising and mind control is unfortunately part of our future, and something that we really have to be, I guess, to start off with, aware of how powerful this technology is, and then cognizant of its various dark sides. I feel a need to just go back to our organizers, because I'm seeing lots of questions come in, and I also see from our clock that maybe we're supposed to be responding to them now. And I love talking to Kerry. I just want to make sure we're being polite to everybody else in the room with us.
Well, that's so considerate of you, Mark. We do have some questions that have come in, and there's kind of two ways that we can go about them. I can read them and direct them, or also if people want to ask their own question, if I call on them, then I guess they could unmute and ask their own question. I think we've gotten rid of
let's do that,
jokers
Leonie.
at the beginning. Yeah, so maybe Let's see, George, you had the very first question that kind of relates to what Mark was just talking about being able to see or identify thoughts or memories on an fMRI. Did you want to ask that question?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Hi, Mark. And
Hi.
that is if you're doing, you talked about being able to see memories, identity, things, specific things going on in an individual brain. And that's kind of scary and also interesting. But if you're looking at an individual, don't you need kind of a pretty specific baseline in order to be able to interpret what that data is doing? Because even though the hemispheres of the brain are going to be similar from person to person, aren't there lots of very specific differences down in the individual circuitry?
Yeah, so very wise questions. The answer is, as always, complicated. If I were to try to identify in your brain whether you were thinking about moving your finger, I could do it without pre-training, because the shape of your brain around those portions of your brain that control your finger is remarkably consistent from one person to the next. If, on the other hand, I wanted to see how it is you derive the Euler series, on a piece of paper and doing math, there's not a chance in the world that I could compare your brain to somebody else's. So part of it has to do with those features of our brain which are evolutionarily built in and incredibly highly conserved, and as opposed to things that are learned during your lifetime. Even so, you could see remarkable homology across individuals. We meaning the greater neuroscience community, not just myself and my buddies, have been in the business of brain reading for quite some time. And among the things that people do is say, I'm going to train some artificial intelligence algorithm to read out the brain of George, and then I'm going to see if I can read out the brain of Kerry using the same set of tools. And shockingly, you could do it to a relatively good degree. But these are all done with machine learning methods that are so highly abstract that you can't then take apart the box and say, what is it about Kerry's brain that was similar to George's brain? You can only say there's some global pattern of this and that. Tough answer. But you're absolutely right that if I wanted to do, for example, like Kamatami's work in reading dreams, they had to train those volunteers, or actually to train the computer on those volunteers. Here's what you look like when you're looking at an ocean. And then I can look for that pattern in your brain at 10 p.m. And see it. You're muted. George, you're muted.
Yeah, so sorry. When you have a computer that's able to do that with machine learning and all the rest of the stuff, and comes up with some conclusion, and you go back and ask the computer, how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, any more than, how did you know that she was sad? Christ, I don't know. We're living inside our own very abstract box.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question from John Kaparski, asking Kerry and Mark about their view on the metaphorical use of memory. John, did you want to expand on that question, or you want me to read it?
Yeah, well, it's pretty much there, but I could try to expand a bit.
Yeah, why don't you read it?
Right. So we often talk about physical objects as though they were memories. Photographs are memories, sculptures are memorials, novels are memoirs, and so forth. And of course, that doesn't work at all. Like a photograph is the opposite of a memory in almost every respect that you're interested in. But we love this metaphor. And I'm curious if you have, from your two interesting perspectives, any ideas on why that's such a tempting metaphor that we go to so often.
Maybe I'll take a stab at that first, and I don't know if it'll really answer your question, but I'm particularly interested in the way that the objects that we refer to as mementos or memories come to stand in for and replace the memories that we have. I think that because that that's in the domain of representation and something that we can control. And so the way in which we kind of, and this speaks again to my kind of interest in psychoanalysis and the way in which we curate our past according to our present needs, that, who hasn't found a triggering photo of, someone they broke up with and wanted to tear it up and throw it away. So and who hasn't had the experience of remembering all kinds of things from early childhood because there are photos of it that couldn't actually have happened. So I think the temptation to function in that sort of metaphorical realm is, because it provides a kind of psychological satisfaction and a sense of control over something that's ultimately, well beyond our control and well beyond, the scale of information of our past, where we to recall it all would obviously be totally untenable to walk around with.
I like that we refer to them as memories because they're replacing the memories. I really like that.
Well, and when you're in the business of making images and making representation, you have to be very careful because, I've worked with children, I've worked with elderly people. The children are no longer those same children. The elderly people, some of them are no longer alive. So these representations come and stand in for them out in the world. And that feels like a tremendous responsibility.
I'd also love to hear, Mark, from your perspective as well.
So the way you framed it had to do with the notion that these objects are not themselves the memory. And that's true. I mean, at any point, all they can really be is symbols for the memory or triggers for the memory. And then the memory itself takes place inside the person. If I were to give you a string of characters in some language you didn't understand or in an alphabet whose sounds you didn't recognize, they would be without meaning, right? They're only symbols for people who can identify and resonate with the contents that they're looking at. I'm also interested, as I think the word memento came up. I've forgotten whether it was Kerry or you who said that, John. But one of the interesting things about some of these objects is they're more veridical than our own memories. That is, I showed you this picture of the Hillbilly Ranch, which, by the way, doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed for 20 years or 30 years. And I don't really remember it very well. The picture, I look at it and say, well, yeah, I think it was like that. But if I had drawn it on paper, I wouldn't have come up with it. So those kinds of mementos are interesting too. And as Kerry said, some of the documents she's creating about people are precious in that way. They are the last surviving engrams of those people and probably more reliable than the memories of the people around them.
Although, of course, they're highly structured, directed, and edited by me, which again brings up, this is the problem of being an empathic filmmaker that, is interested in kind of documentary production. How do you know what to edit, and how do you, where do you draw the line between what is going to work for you as an artist with your ideas and what's going to work for the subjects that are, willing to collaborate with you?
Yeah, were the Beatles always polite when they were hanging around in the studio, or did they actually say nasty things to the folks who were bringing them wine that they didn't like? Who knows?
Well,
Somebody edited that.
There's that great new documentary. Yeah.
Well, that's the point, but it was edited. I mean, we don't know what's on the floor.
Right.
Yeah, I remember when Google had their glasses, about 10 years ago. There's the whole frou-frou about that. And people made the argument, which seemed amazing to me, that I'm allowed to walk into a space and remember what happened. Therefore, I'm allowed to have constant recordings of all of this. And that just struck me. And I'm still kind of wondering about how that works in people's heads. So thanks.
Well, and if I can just, build on that, because I am quite obsessed with memory, is the way in which the internet just never forgets and how our representations exceed ourselves. And as a parent of, tweens and a tween and a teen, the representations that go floating around of us in these moments where we're, I would say I've got bright, I got smart kids, savvy kids, and yet what are they going to put about themselves online? And is the self that's going to discover them years later after the thing has gone viral, the same self that put them out there in the first place? And who's responsible for that?
Right, and it could have lasting effects. And at the same time, when you really need to find something on the internet, somehow it's gone and you have like rot link and you can't find it. So both things are possible.
Or it's been altered. I've had that problem. I had a colleague who had a very, very powerful website. He died. Somebody bought the domain and is using his identity in order to pimp their flaky medical products. It's scary.
Wow. All right. Well, it looks like we're almost at the end of our time here. So I would just like to give both Kerry and Mark the opportunity for maybe a final comment or a final question to one another or to the audience to leave us with this evening.
Wow. I'll start by saying thank you. What a huge opportunity this is. What an honor to be asked by Kerry to be in the same room and to enjoy this. And I guess I'm just leave with that. I'm thrilled and pleased to have been here and really appreciate everybody's time.
Yeah, well, the feeling is mutual. And I do have one thing. I'll blame it on my ADHD. Leonie, there are a couple of events. So like I alluded to a bunch of projects and Mark alluded to a bunch of projects, and there's actually a screening happening that I have no idea where I put the information about when it is. And there's another screening happening somewhere else. Do you have that information? Is that something you might post in the chat or just share in case, you know, people want to, yeah, virtual talks and stuff. If you're curious about.
Yeah, I can say it out loud quickly and then I'll type it because it'll be faster for me to just say it. So on Wednesday, March 16th at 6:30 at the Paramount Bright Family Screening Room at Emerson College, we will have a public screening of some of Kerry's early works. It starts at 6:30, the doors open at 6, and she will screen 3 of her early pieces and also give an artist talk. So if you're really interested, please come to that. And then there will be is the event at Mass Art virtual or in person?
Yeah,
Kerry?
so there's a I think
virtual.
I think it's
right?
I think you can, yes, there's a virtual talk and I think a live screening in Boston on the 22nd, maybe.
I think it's the 24th, on Monday, the 24th, but
Yeah.
I'll put them in the chat quickly.
Thanks. Really a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Kerry and Mark and our audience here this evening. I could see now how there's so much more to be said, and we could probably be talking for another 2 or 3 hours. And it's so really refreshing and exciting to hear the way that your practices intersect and overlap and are mutually engaging and stimulating. So thank you both so very much.
I can't wait to have more time with Kerry.
In real life next time.
Real, yeah, real, yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Well, I'd like to put a big thank you out to Kerry and Mark and also to Leonie. We're about to go down to the bar right now and open up the conversation to the group for open mics. Before that, just want to remind people to stay in touch on social media, become a member, volunteer for long now, and watch your mailboxes for an Eventbrite invite to our first Monday, April 7th conversation with Danny Warshay. We hope you'll join us now downstairs in the lobby bar for an open mic chat with Kerry, Mark, Leonie. And for those of you who need to head home now, be careful driving. Thanks for joining us this evening. Mics are open. And we still ask that you raise your hand. We'll do our best to ensure that everyone who wishes to speak has their opportunity. Please don't be shy, and if the moment seems appropriate, just jump right in.
Wait, are you going to a real bar right now?
We are. Here's one to you.
Oh, and okay.
Yes, to you.
Oh, I want my drink.
We're in
I got one in, I'll be right back.
This is
exactly.
this is bar.
We're all gonna go get
here.
drinks. Awesome.
And we're actually,
I was gonna say, I was like, this is a proverbial bar, right? Oh my gosh.
When you folks were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about from a memory standpoint is that in acting, in method acting, there's this thing called sense memory that we use to draw on that triggers realities that other people believe. As if we're actors, they just believe that reality, and as the actor, we believe it too. And I'm wondering, how does that kind of thing affect people who are not actors, but people who are just doing it in the subconscious and beyond denial kind of things? But where do those kinds of memories fit in? Anyone?
I want to hear from, I mean, I don't know. It seems like we got a lot of brilliant neuroscientists in the audience. I don't know if we have a lot of people that work in performance and art, but, and I also have to admit I was getting a drink, so I missed the beginning of the question, but we're talking about method acting, right? Yes, cheers. Cheers, Mark.
Right, cheers. And method acting and
Rachel, you can
sense
sit
memory
with me.
kind of work.
Be on the screen.
Where you
It's all
do,
good.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to meet you. COVID, sorry, I'm really sorry. COVID made it impossible to really meet you. Now we're here. Okay. Yes, go on.
this is more interesting. People crawling around on the floor are more interesting than acting. But when you do a sense memory in method acting, you draw on memories that you have that are going to trigger emotions that you can then use to make things real.
Right.
And how does that happen when people who aren't, who aren't actors, just lay people who are using this every day in the subconscious? And how does that work to inform their realities and other people's through memory?
Are you thinking about how, are you describing, so you referred to people doing this subconsciously. Are you thinking about, I love this, seeing everybody having a drink. Are you thinking about the way that, I mean, I don't know, do people do that? Do people, not method actors, actually try to produce strong emotional reactions?
No, I don't think they do. I don't think they do try. I think it just happens.
Yeah, I think it does just happen. Well, I will say, I'll just share, I mean, my 2 cents about that is that, I never went to film school, but I find myself working in film and directing actors a lot. And I do think that the best acting that I've seen, the most convincing and naturalistic acting that I've seen among the many, more and less talented actors I've worked with, comes less from their internal, I've got something I'm thinking about, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's triggering these emotions and I can cry on cue. I've had lots of people in auditions spontaneously cry on cue, often at inappropriate moments, just to sort of demonstrate their ability, should there be a part in this project or some other in which it would be convenient and helpful to have someone that can, like, cry on cue. But actually the secret to good acting is listening, which brings us back to empathy. I mean, there's something that goes on in the micro expressions of the face when one is really paying attention. And maybe this also goes back to meditation, that is subtle and compelling and quite convincing. And that I think others can read. We sense what you are feeling by these micro expressions that may not be linguistic and maybe much subtler than the larger, although I guess great method actors may not just be producing tears on cue, but also, all kinds of more subtle responses.
Kerry, talk with us about the piece you did where you acted the fractured video segments. I forgot the name.
Yeah. So I made a live performance. I think I showed a picture of it in the slideshow, called Critical Mass. I watched an experimental structuralist film from 1971 in which a filmmaker had gone to a film school and said, who are your most volatile students? And everyone in the faculty agreed it was this woman, Barb, and this guy, Frankie. And the filmmaker, Hollis Frampton, said to Barb and Frankie, all right, I've got 5 reels of film. I've got a big, long thing of mag audio tape. You guys have a big fight. All right, Barb, Frankie's been gone. He's not going to tell you where he went. You want to know the answer. You're pissed off. Frankie, you're never going to tell her. So really typical sort of heteronormative 1970s sexual politics kinds of dynamics. And then Frampton filmed the 2 of them. They had this amazing blowout, knockdown feud, totally convincing. But instead of playing that film back, he made 5 copies of it and cut it into little tiny snippets and threw the snippets out of sync with the sound. So what you're watching is this explosive argument that, rather than have a traditional sort of arc of a narrative, proceeds in sort of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I found the piece really exciting in the form, in the ways that I find experiences of cognitive dissonance really exciting. I'm like, how is it that I'm empathizing with these actors? How is it that I'm moved by what they're experiencing when clearly this is like the most staged thing in the entire world? And at that same moment, when I realized what effect this piece was having on me, I thought, it's a really dumb idea, but would be really interesting to try to do this as a live performance. And so I ended up hiring 2 actors, casting 2 actors to perform live as Barb and Frankie, a 25-minute knockdown brawl in which they say exactly what was said in the original film, cut for cut, edit by edit. And so as an audience member, you walk into this, into this performance, not knowing what to expect, hearing people perform kind of like a crazily edited soundtrack. And what seemed to happen for the audience of that project was similarly, I think maybe intensified, because there are live people in front of you and the stakes feel much higher and they're like yelling and sweating in the room, like, 10 feet in front of you. But there did seem to be this kind of learning that happens for the viewer that's quite different from that experience of you see, like, I don't know, a close up on Matt Damon and these little move, the way he looks, and you just feel it, you know what he's thinking. And with these people, it was like so distanced. But I think our drive to identify and relate is very, very powerful. And so over the course of the 25-minute live performance, you had people really taking sides in this. And afterwards, people would say, God, that Barb, what a piece of work. Or, why wouldn't Frankie just tell her? And I want to say, how did you even follow that story? In the beginning, it's like, God, turn it off. And 5 minutes in, your brain's been trained to actually make sense of it and kind of reverse engineer the editorial process that went along the way. So different kind of acting, the opposite, I think, of method acting, but also quite powerful.
I'd like to follow up. This gets back to what Mark was saying about, what the human brain is generally programmed to do, make order of things and structure things. And isn't it also true that we are attracted to novelty? In part, you can imagine in the Paleolithic jungle, you are going to be looking for those small telltale, evidence of the lion in the, in the bushes. So we are attracted to novelty, and maybe that's part of what gives art its power to capture the imagination. Mark, does that make sense to you?
Yes and no. I think that we are attracted to novelty, but only if it's within some context that we can make sense of. We're undistracted, remarkably undistracted by the gorilla in the room. If anybody has seen some of those crazy videos, because we can only bend so far from our reality. We're attracted by new pieces of our environment that in some way inform our context. I don't know the answer to that really. We spent a lot of time studying attention. We do EEG to study attention. It's a great way to do it because you can get a measurement in a couple of milliseconds to see attentional changes. And all I can say is it's wild out there. You can make people attend and not attend, and but the mechanism, who the hell knows? It's wild.
Yeah.
And maybe that's an explanation for things like, conspiracy theories and rigid denialism is like, oh man, it's just too confusing out there. I'm just going to stick with something I understand and eliminate any other interference so that it seems like it's.
I have something to say about that. I think that we are very much predisposed to assume a connectedness of the things that are out there in the world. We need that narrative. It's more of the filling in I was talking about. We do it in time, we do it in social structure, every other place. But any form of a narrative is better than none. And people make these remarkably implausible things, of Zeus coming down and throwing lightning bolts, or, somebody having virgin children, or some virgin having children. They make no sense in our real world. But the fact that they connect the events, that's enough. We don't spend a lot of time worrying about whether they connect plausibly. And the conspiracy theories are very much that way. We see 4 buildings go down in New York City, and we have to assume that there's a connection. We can't see some piece of the World Trade Center falling on the next building over. So there must be a bomb in the next building over, and that's the connection.
And I think in terms of aesthetic, maybe this is coming at the other angle from that, that's the pleasure of novelty. There's also the pleasure of, is it Ernst Riegel who describes the beholder's share? Is that right? This idea, right? What's that?
Somebody smarter than us has to answer.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, somebody else. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. Are we still being recorded? That, part of, I think, the pleasure of the Picasso drawing that you showed is that it does leave something to the imagination, and there's great satisfaction in being drawn in and sort of participating. I don't know the evolutionary argument for that, but I do know, and this is something that oh God, Eric Kandel writes about, he's got a whole book about the Vienna School and abstract expressionism and not even abstract, well, sort of abstract expressionism, but these sort of gestural suggestions of a landscape that often carry more of a kind of emotional charge because they're not fully described, and they leave something for the viewer to fill in, and that you know, I don't know. I think we also we want to make meaning. I don't know the evolutionary reason behind that either, but it's very satisfying to be teased with a little sense that something is a kind of an incomplete picture, but the great satisfaction in solving that problem, it just feels really good.
I have to add a little footnote. Eric Kandel, who really made his mark on the world by studying how memory works in snails. And he's a phenomenal neuroscientist who's done so much that's so profound. You know, his other books are, for example, a 3-inch thick tome called Neuroscience, or the Handbook of Neuroscience, something like that. But somebody who discovered the joy of big thinking late in life.
Yeah, and didn't he start by studying like a leech or a sea slug or something?
A snail called the Aplysia, a giant sea snail.
Yes.
It's funny, we're talking about this, without that predisposition to seek meaning and connection, it's hard to imagine how a conversation could ever happen. I mean, that's kind of like the basics of pragmatics, right? Is that, you know, you need to make a bunch of assumptions that we're all having the same conversation, and that what you're going to say is relevant and so forth. And if we don't do that, and that's why the Turing test is so easy for a computer to pass, we're giving away the game from the start. And that's, you know, I hadn't thought of it in terms of conspiracy theories, but I think it fits perfectly well. We're a victim of our willingness to have a conversation, and that just allows us to be hacked. It's the same way those nice boys that hacked this conversation at the start made us a victim of our openness and willingness to share the Zoom link from the start.
I'm happy to say that I'm working very hard on trying to produce an exhibit for one of my favorite museums, having to do with the imperative of bias. That bias, we have to have bias. We can't live without bias. That we color the words so negatively, you know, and the trick for all of us is to recognize that our biases are always there, and to try and understand which of them we're depending on at this moment.
You know, on that, friends, I think that's last call. And we're going to say thank you very much.